Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking an absolutely massive case from the Constitutional Court of South Africa, the Government of the Republic of South Africa versus Irene Grootboom. This case is a fascinating look at one of the most difficult challenges any emerging democracy faces. Think about it. How exactly does a nation balance the massive, long-term state programs required for overall societal development with the immediate, desperate human crises unfolding on the ground right in front of them? As we go through this, we're going to break down the legal arguments, the harsh human realities, and a final verdict that fundamentally shape the future of socioeconomic rights.
We'll be navigating this through 6 quick parts: the Wallerstein housing crisis, eviction and homelessness, the constitutional dilemma, Section 28 regarding children's rights, Section 26 on housing rights, and finally, the verdict.
Okay, let's dive right in. 206,000. That's a staggering number, isn't it? It represents the massive backlog of housing units needed in the Cape Metro area at the time of this case. So the local government was facing a truly mammoth macro-level problem. Thousands of families were migrating, and the demand was surging at a rate of 20,000 family units a year. Meanwhile, the state could only build about 22,000 houses annually. That means this massive backlog was barely even shrinking. The pressure on the state's resources was just immense.
But we can't just look at the macro data here. We have to zoom in on the actual human reality at the heart of this dispute. Contrast that massive 206,000 backlog with this number, 900. There were 900 human respondents in this specific case. And honestly, this is the heartbreaking part. 510 of them were children. These weren't just statistics on a spreadsheet. These were actual families, parents, and kids caught right in the crosshairs of a massive housing shortage.
Section 1. The Wallerstein housing crisis.
Now, to really understand this crisis, the court first had to look backward. Justice Jaco put it bluntly in his judgment, saying, "The cause of the acute housing shortage lies in apartheid." The court noted that a central feature of that policy was influx control, which was specifically designed to limit African occupation of urban areas. In fact, family housing for African people in the Cape Peninsula was literally frozen in 1962. This historical legacy of frozen development and forced racial distribution of land led directly to the massive informal squatter settlements the country was trying to manage decades later.
Which brings us directly to the Wallerstein settlement, the place Irene Grootboom and her community called home. And the conditions here, they were absolutely severe. We're talking a quarter of households with zero income. Over 2/3 were scraping by on less than 500 Rand a month. Half the population were kids. Everyone was living in shacks with no water, no sewage, and no refuse removal. Parts of the area were completely waterlogged. Many of these families had been sitting on a waiting list for low-cost housing for as long as 7 years, with absolutely no definite answers in sight. They were enduring truly intolerable conditions.
Section 2. Eviction and homelessness.
So, let's walk through the actual timeline here. Faced with an indefinite wait in these flooded shacks, the community took desperate action. In September 1998, they moved out of Wallerstein and illegally occupied some vacant private land called New Rust. By December, the property owner obtained an ejectment order. And then came the critical turning point. On May 18, 1999, the community was prematurely and forcibly evicted at the municipality's expense. Their homes were literally bulldozed and burnt to the ground. They fled to a local sports field, sheltering under flimsy plastic sheeting just as the freezing, rainy Cape winter started setting in.
This brings us to a brilliantly nuanced view from the court. Justice Jaco wrote, "People should not be impelled by intolerable living conditions to resort to land invasions." It's a really important distinction. The court was crystal clear that self-help and illegal land invasions, they absolutely cannot be tolerated because having available land is essential to solving the broader housing crisis. But crucially, the court also acknowledged the root cause here. You simply cannot ignore the intolerable living conditions that drive desperate people to take such drastic steps in the first place.
Section 3. The Constitutional Dilemma.
Okay, so the first constitutional anchor we need to look at is Section 26. This states that everyone has the right to have access to adequate housing. Sounds straightforward, right? But pay close attention to the wording that follows. It says the state must take reasonable measures within its available resources to achieve the progressive realization of this right. In plain English, the Constitution doesn't demand the government give everyone a free house tomorrow. It means the state has to improve things step by step over time based on the actual budgets they have to work with.
And that builds right into our second legal anchor, which is Section 28. Now, unlike Section 26, which applies to everybody, Section 28 zeroes in specifically on children. It explicitly states that every child has the right to basic nutrition, shelter, basic health care, and social services. Notice what's missing there? There is absolutely no language about available resources or progressive realization. It just straight up says children have the right to shelter.
Section 4. Children's Rights, Section 28.
When the High Court looked at the desperately sad situation on that flooded sports field, they actually ruled in favor of the community. They anchored their whole decision on Section 28. Since the right of children to shelter isn't qualified by available resources, the High Court ordered the state to provide immediate rudimentary shelter, stuff like tents and portable latrines, for the children and by extension for the parents who needed to supervise them. Essentially, they ruled that children get shelter on demand.
Now, what's really interesting about this is the massive plot twist that happened when the case reached the Constitutional Court. They actually overturned the High Court's reasoning. Why? Well, they pointed out a huge anomaly. If parents get housing simply because they have kids, it basically makes children stepping stones to housing for adults, while entirely leaving behind desperate, childless adults or the elderly. The Constitutional Court ruled that under Section 28, the primary duty to provide shelter actually lies with the parents. The state only has a primary duty to provide direct shelter to children if those kids are removed from their families or abandoned. Since these children were still with their parents, Section 28 just wasn't the right legal tool for the job.
Section 5. Housing Rights, Section 26.
So if Section 28 doesn't apply here, we need to understand what Section 26 actually requires the state to do. The court noted that housing isn't just about handing over bricks and mortar, it's about access to land, services like water, and financing. The state is required to create a comprehensive, coordinated program. For people who can afford to pay, the state must unlock the housing market. But for those who cannot, like the folks in the Wallenstein community, the state must provide social welfare. And all of these measures have to be evaluated by one key standard. Are they reasonable?
Now the government pushed back. They argued, hey, we actually do have a massive, well-funded national housing program building hundreds of thousands of homes. But the Constitutional Court spotted a critical flaw. While the state's long-term program was reasonable in its general design and goals, it completely ignored a huge segment of society living in immediate, desperate crisis. A program that only focuses on the medium and long term, but leaves people who are living in intolerable conditions with absolutely no relief in sight, that completely fails the constitutional test of reasonableness.
Section 6. The Final Verdict.
So, what happened in the end? The Constitutional Court ultimately ruled that the Cape Metro housing program did, in fact, fall short of its constitutional obligations. Yes, they had a solid long-term plan, but they entirely failed to provide for those in desperate, urgent need. The court ordered the state to devise, fund, and implement a comprehensive program that specifically included reasonable measures to provide relief for people with literally no roof over their heads, living in crisis situations. And to make sure this wasn't just an empty legal promise, the court ordered the Human Rights Commission to actively monitor the state's compliance with the ruling.
All of this leaves us with a pretty profound question. How exactly should a nation balance long-term development with the immediate survival of its most vulnerable citizens? The Grootboom case didn't magically promise a house for everyone overnight, but it firmly established a massive precedent. The state cannot just turn a blind eye to its citizens in immediate crisis while building for the future. It's a delicate balancing act of human dignity and available resources that continues to resonate today. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep asking the big questions.